You can find criminal laws on the books in various states publishing activities such as playing dominoes on Sunday, feeding an alcoholic beverage to a mouse, cursing on a miniature golf course, making love in a car, or performing a wedding ceremony when either the bride or the groom is drunk. In Louisiana, you risk being sentenced to 10 years in prison for stealing an alligator, whether dead or alive, valued at $1,000. The nature of criminal law. Are there common characteristics of acts that are labeled as crimes? How do we define crime? The easy answer is that a crime is whether the law declares to be a criminal offense and publishes with a penalty. The difficulty with this approach is that not all criminal convictions result in a fine or imprisonment. Rather than publishing a defendant, the judge may merely warn him or her not to repeat the criminal act. Most commentators stress that the important feature of a crime is that it is an act officially condemned by the community and carries a sense of shame and humiliation. Professor Henry M. Hart, Jr. defines crime as conduct which, if shown to have taken place, will result in the formal and solemn pronouncement of the moral condemnation of the community. The central point of Professor Hart's definition is that crime is subject to formal condemnation by a judge and jury representing the people in a court of law. This distinguishes a crime from acts most people would find objectionable that typically are not subject to state prosecution and official punishment. We might, for instance, criticize someone who cheats on his or her spouse, but we genuinely leave the solution to an individuals involved. Other matters are left to institutions to settle. Schools generally discipline students who cheat or disrupt class, but this rarely results in a criminal charge. Professional baseball, basketball, and football leagues have their own private procedures for disciplining players. Most states leave the decision whether to recycle trash to the individual and look to peer pressure to enforce this obligation. Criminal and civil law. How does criminal law differ from civil law? Legal law is that branch of the law that protects the individual rather than the public interest. A legal action for civil wrong is brought by an individual rather than a state prosecutor. You may sue a mechanic who breaks a contract to repair your car, or bring an action against a landlord who fails to adequately heat up your apartment. The injury is primarily to you as an individual, and there is relatively little harm to society. A mechanic who intentionally misleads and harms a number of innocent customers, however, may find himself or herself charged with criminal fraud. Civil and criminal actions are characterized by different legal procedures. For instance, conviction of a crime requires the highest standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, although responsibility for a civil wrong is established by a much lower standard of proof, by a preponderance of the evidence, or roughly 51% certainty. The highest standard of proof in criminal cases reflects the fact that the criminal conviction may result in a loss of liberty and significant damage to an individual's reputation and standing in the community. The famous 18th century English jurist William Blackstone summarized the distinction between civil and criminal law by observing that civil injuries are an infringement of the civil rights which belong to an individual. Public wrongs or crimes are a breach of violation of the public rights and duties due to the whole community in its social great capacity. Blackstone illustrates this difference by pointing out that society has little interest in whether someone sues a neighbor or emerges victorious in a land dispute. On the other hand, society has substantial investment in the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of an individual responsible for espionage, murder, and robbery. The difference between a civil and criminal action is not always clear, particularly with regard to an action for tort, which is an injury to a person or his or her property. Consider the drunken driver who runs a red light and hits your car. The driver may be sued in tort for negligently damaging you and your property, as well as criminally prosecuted for reckless driving. The practical and emotional injuries you have suffered. In contrast, the criminal action punishes the driver for endangering society. Civil liability is based on preponderance of the evidence standard, while a criminal conviction carries a possible loss of liberty and is based on the higher standards of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. You may recall that former football star O.J. Simpson was acquitted of murdering Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, but was later found guilty of wrongful death in a civil court in order to compensate the victims' families in the amount of $33.5 million. The distinction between the criminal and civil law proved immensely significant for Kansas inmate Leroy Hendricks. Hendricks was about to be released after serving 10 years in prison for molesting two 13-year-old boys. This was the latest episode in the Hendricks' almost 30-year history of indecent exposure and molestation of young children. Hendricks freely conceded that when not confined, the only way to control his sexual urge was to die. Upon learning that Hendricks was about to be released, Kansas authorities invoked the Sexually Violent Predator Act of 1994, which authorized the institutional confinement of individuals who, due to a mental abnormality or personality disorder, are likely to engage in predatory acts of sexual violence. Following a hearing, a jury found Hendricks to be a sexual predator. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Hendricks' continued commitment was a civil rather than a criminal penalty, and that Hendricks was not being unconstitutionally punished twice for the same criminal act of molestation. The court explained that the purpose of the commitment procedure was to detain and treat Hendricks in order to prevent him from harming others in the future, rather than to punish him. Do you think that decision of the U.S. Supreme Court makes sense?